Welcome back to Whisper Horror Channel. Do you still remember the knock at 3 AM? That door. Did you open it? Because if you heard it, and you're still alive today, it only means the thing waiting for you hasn't gotten close enough. In the last part, we crossed the line. Now, it's time to face what we've never clearly seen. If you're ready, leave a comment below. And don't forget to follow Whisper Horror Channel. We won't let you walk alone. After leaving the Daisy bedroom, Annelise walked through the secret corridor with a new determination. Fear hadn't completely vanished, it was merely pushed back by a sense of purpose. A sacred curiosity. Eleanor's diary, clutched tightly under her arm, was like a map, and the silver hair brooch in her jacket pocket gave her a strange sense of security, like a protective charm. The darkness in the secret passage was no longer absolute. A faint, flickering light began to appear ahead, like the glow of a distant torch. Along with the light came a change in temperature. The air was no longer uniformly cold, but became erratic, changing with every step. At times, she felt a dry, hot blast of air on her face, as if standing before a furnace. Immediately after, a biting cold enveloped her, so cold she could see her own breath. She stepped out of the narrow passage and froze, overwhelmed by the sight before her. She was standing at the beginning of a long, very long corridor. This was no ordinary corridor. The left wall was completely bare, covered in faded geometric pattern wallpaper, but the right wall was lined with fireproof bricks and dominated by a series of fireplaces, dozens of them, stretching all the way to the end of the corridor. They were of all shapes and sizes, some smaller and simple cast iron, others large and elaborately decorated with marble and tiles. Most were cold and dark, their black mouths gaping like entrances to hell. But a few of them were burning. An orange flame danced in one fireplace, radiating pleasant warmth. A few meters away, another fireplace flared with a strange blue flame, silent and emitting a bone-chilling cold. This was the Hall of Fires. Annelise knew it. Just as she had known the name of the Daisy bedroom, she immediately understood the purpose of this place. With her crippling arthritis, Mrs. Eleanor always needed warmth. This corridor was built to ensure she would never feel cold when moving between areas of the house. But it was more than just a heating system. It was a place of extremes, of hot and cold, of life and death. Annelise began to walk cautiously. The hardwood floor made no sound under her footsteps. But she was not alone. Clop! A sound echoed from behind her, clear and distinct. It was the sound of a man's shoe striking the wooden floor. Annelise startled and turned around. The corridor was long and empty. No one was there. She swallowed, turned back, and continued walking, trying to convince herself it was just an illusion. The sound of the old house. Clop! Clop! This time there were two sounds, closer, and there was a heavy, weary shuffle to them. At the same time, a blast of icy cold swept over her. Even though the nearest fireplace was burning brightly with an orange flame, she turned around again. Still no one. Only long, eerie shadows cast by the erratic flames danced on the walls. Fear began to return, seeping through her resolve. She knew someone, or something, was following her, an invisible spirit that could make sounds. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. Clop! 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 The footsteps were now right behind her, urgent and heavy. The temperature around her dropped suddenly. Annelise could feel the cold seeping through her jacket, making her shiver. She dared not turn back again. She just ran forward, fleeing from the invisible footsteps. She ran through streaks of hot and cold, past flames of all colors, while the footsteps continued steadily behind her, neither faster nor slower, a horrifying rhythm of an inescapable chase. As she ran in a panic, a cast-iron fireplace door, decorated with the image of a lion, suddenly let out a creak and sprang open. Annelise stopped abruptly, the footsteps behind her also ceasing. This fireplace wasn't burning. Inside, instead of ashes, there was a pile of papers. Small, crumpled pieces of paper, singed at the edges. An invisible pull drew her closer. She knelt down, hesitated for a moment, then reached into the cold hearth. She picked up a piece of paper. It was brittle and fragile. She carefully unfolded it. The handwriting on it was Eleanor's. It was a letter, but with no recipient, to no one. The letter read, "Today, one of the workmen asked me why I built a closet door only 1 meter high. I did not answer. How could I explain to him that I did it for the soul of a child? A boy who died in a hunting accident from my father's rifle? How could I say that I believe the boy's soul is still here? And I wanted to have a place to hide that fits its size." Annelise picked up another piece. "I wrote to my sister in Connecticut, telling her about the whispers, about the faces I saw in the windows. She wrote back, advising me to travel, to see a psychiatrist. She doesn't understand. No one understands. I burned her letter in this fireplace. The warmth of the fire cannot dispel the cold of solitude." She realized. This was where Eleanor shed the thoughts, the fears she couldn't share with anyone. She wrote these letters and burned them, sending them into nothingness through the flames. These were her deepest secrets, even more private than the diary. Reading them, Annelise felt this woman's pain was much greater than she had imagined. She wasn't just haunted. She was misunderstood and ostracized by the living world. As Annelise stood up, still holding the singed pieces of letters, she felt a change in the air. The corridor was no longer empty. From the walls, from the fireplace doors, figures began to emerge. They didn't appear suddenly. They slowly solidified from the air, faint and translucent like smoky glass. They were spirits. There was a man with a thick moustache, dressed in worker's clothes, his hands seemingly pushing an invisible wheelbarrow. There were women in tightly corseted Victorian dresses, holding non-existent fans. There were even uniformed servants, moving silently and purposefully. They moved along the corridor, passing through each other, passing through the burning fireplaces without being affected. They were repeating their daily tasks. A memory tape played over and over again without end. These were the staff, the servants who had once lived and worked in this manor. Annelise stood motionless, not daring to breathe loudly, but these spirits didn't seem to notice her presence. Their eyes were empty, looking through her as if she didn't exist. They brushed past her, so close she could feel a fleeting coldness. But none of them looked at her. They always avoided her gaze, as if an invisible rule prevented them from interacting with the world of the living. It was a silent procession of the deceased, a ghostly world existing in parallel right beside the real world, but never intersecting. The feeling of utter solitude. She was surrounded by dozens of spirits, yet she was completely alone. Annelise backed away, trying to avoid the invisible crowd. She retreated to the end of the corridor, and then, one of the largest fireplaces at the end of the corridor, a white marble fireplace, suddenly flared up. Whoosh! But this was no ordinary fire. The flame was emerald green, bright but emitting no heat whatsoever. It burned silently, with no crackling of wood. And within that flame, a silhouette began to form. It was the silhouette of a woman, tall and slender, wearing a long black dress, white gloved hands. Her hair was formally coiffed, The silhouette was faint and shimmered with the flame. But Annelise recognized her instantly. It was Eleanor Whitgrave. Exactly as she had seen her in the portrait. Annelise held her breath. Here it was. This was what the diary had warned about. If you see me, follow the Hall of Fire. She was in the Hall of Fires. And she was seeing her. Eleanor's silhouette didn't look at her. She was looking into the flame. Her face imbued with infinite sadness. She didn't speak. But a whisper echoed directly in Annelise's mind. As clear as if she were standing right beside her. Fire holds names. Annelise looked at the singed letter pieces in her hand. Yes. The fire had kept her names. Her thoughts. The voice came again. This time with more urgency. Mirrors hold shadows. Shadows? Annelise remembered the broken silver mirror in her pocket. It held her reflection. But perhaps it held other things too. The emerald green flame suddenly extinguished. And Eleanor's silhouette vanished. The fireplace became cold and empty again. The other spirits also faded and disappeared into the walls. Annelise was alone again in the long, silent corridor. She looked down at the two tokens she had, the letters forgiven by fire, and the mirror that held shadows. She still didn't fully understand their meaning, but she knew they were the next pieces of the puzzle. Eleanor hadn't just left a labyrinth. She had left a path, and Annelise was the only one who could walk that path. Outside Whitgrave Manor, the world of the living still operated in chaos and helplessness. Police headlights swept back and forth. Uniformed figures moved about futilely. In one corner, the Whitgraves were wrapped in blankets, their bodies trembling not from cold, but from pain beyond endurance. They were just islands of suffering, surrounded by an ocean of meaningless activity. All of them, from the most seasoned police officer to the heartbroken father, looked at the house as an adversary, a physical structure holding a secret. They searched with their eyes, with their hands, with search dogs. They searched for a flesh and blood girl. Gabriel arrived, silently like a ghost amidst their own ghost hunt. He didn't speak to Lieutenant Al-Jamil, didn't look towards the grieving couple. Verbal comfort was meaningless in the face of such a burden. His eyes were fixed only on the house. He didn't see a structure. He saw a wound. A wound that had festered for a century. And now, it had just swallowed a tender young life in a desperate attempt to heal itself. Without explanation, Gabriel walked towards the main gate. Lieutenant Al-Jamil moved to stop him. But Mr. Gable placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. A silent and weighty gesture. "Just let him in," he said, his voice hoarse. As Gabriel stepped over the threshold, a subtle but distinct change occurred. To those outside, there was no difference. But for Gabriel, the world behind him blurred, its sounds diminishing to a distant hum. He had stepped through an invisible curtain. From the world of logic to the world of memory. The house recognized him. The air inside, already heavy, now seemed to thicken around him. A shadow at the end of the main hall seemed to lengthen unusually, twitching slightly like a living creature. A cold draft from nowhere swept through, carrying the whispers of hundreds of forgotten voices. No longer chaotic sounds, but seemingly silent. Observing. The house was holding its breath, assessing the uninvited guest who had just entered its domain. Gabriel was not a police officer, not an intruder. He was something else. And the house knew it. Gabriel didn't pull out a map or any equipment. His map was already deeply etched into the very architecture of this place. It was the spiritual map created by Eleanor Whitgrave's obsession. The map of the number 13. While search teams were following physical corridors, Gabriel followed the latitudes and longitudes of pain. He began to move. neither fast nor slow. His footsteps making no sound. His eyes didn't look at the things ordinary people would see. He passed a grand staircase. The police had walked here dozens of times, but they hadn't stopped to count the balusters on the railing. Gabriel had counted 13. He stepped into an empty ballroom. Search teams had shined lights into every corner, but they didn't look up at the ceiling. Gabriel did. There were 13 large wooden planks running across the ceiling. He walked into a corridor, where a row of brass vents ran along the base of the wall. Mr. Gabriel had passed through here, but he only saw vents. Gabriel stopped. 13 vents. It was a language. A code hidden in plain sight. Every detail repeated 13 times was no accident. They were markers. Spiritual anchors that Eleanor had scattered everywhere to keep her labyrinth stable. To others, they were strange architectural details. To Gabriel, they were signposts. He followed the path of the number 13, delving deeper into areas that search teams had dismissed as unimportant. The path led him to a narrow, dark corridor in the west wing. An unremarkable place. But on the wall, he saw it. A patch of spiderweb pattern wallpaper. The pattern repeating exactly 13 times before transitioning to another section of wall. And right there, Gabriel felt a disturbance in the air. A scar in the house's magnetic field. An invisible door had opened and closed here. Without hesitation, Gabriel placed his hand on the wall. He didn't push. Didn't look for a secret mechanism. He simply placed his hand there and listened. He felt the lingering panic of a child, the curiosity, and then the acceptance. And he also felt another presence, an ancient, weary consciousness that had opened this door. The wall before him remained solid. That door didn't open for him. It only opened for those of the bloodline. But it had left a trace. A spiritual trail. And Gabriel could follow that trail. The spiritual trail led Gabriel through corridors he knew didn't exist on architectural blueprints. He was walking in the memory of the house. He ascended an unreal staircase. Passed through a door that was merely a wall to others. Finally, the path led him to a simple wooden door. He could feel a relative peace radiating from here. An oasis of calm amidst the manor's storm. He opened the door and stepped inside. The daisy bedroom. It was exactly as Annelise had left it. Thick with dust. The air still. But to Gabriel, this room was screaming information. He looked down at the floor. The centuries of thick dust had been disturbed. There were small footprints. Very small. A child's footprints. And there were also knee prints. Right next to the bed frame. A living person had been here. Recently. His gaze shifted to the cedar wood chest under the bed. Its lid was open. The dust on the lid had tiny handprints. Inside it was empty. Something had been taken. Gabriel touched nothing. He just stood there. Closed his eyes. And took a deep breath. He could smell dust and dried daisies. But beneath that, there was another scent. Very faint. The scent of a living body. The smell of cotton. And the smell of tears. He had the evidence. Annelise hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't fallen into some hold. She was walking on another path. A parallel path opened to her by the house itself. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an invited guest. And that was far more terrifying. It meant the house had a purpose for her. Leaving the daisy bedroom, Gabriel knew where he had to go next. Annelise's trail had faded. But the trail of the consciousness that had guided her, Eleanor's spirit, became clearer. It led him towards the north wing. This was a forbidden area. The north wing had partially collapsed in the devastating 1906 earthquake. It was considered structurally unstable and had been locked and sealed with wooden planks and steel doors for decades. Search teams weren't even allowed in here. Gabriel stood before a large, heavy steel door, with a rusted, fist-sized padlock. A danger, do not enter sign hung on the door. To anyone else, this was a dead end. Gabriel just stood there, silently looking at the door. He didn't try to break the lock. He just waited. He knew that if he was on the right path, if the house truly wanted him to help pay its debt, it would have to let him in. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a small click echoed from inside the padlock. The sound of metal groaning as if turned by an unseen force. The rusted bolt slowly retracted with a clank. The heavy steel door creaked open automatically, just enough for a person to pass through. A cold draft, carrying the smell of damp plaster and decay, wafted from the darkness within. The house had allowed him into its deepest, most painful place, its greatest wound. Gabriel stepped into the north wing. This place was completely different from the rest of the manor. The ceiling had large holes, revealing broken beams. Wallpaper hung in shreds like peeled skin. Furniture was crushed, shattered, lying scattered under a thick layer of dust and debris from the ceiling. This was a skeleton of a house, a relic of an ancient rage from deep within the earth. The presence of spirits here was also different. They weren't ghosts repeating daily tasks. They were echoes of panic and extreme pain. Gabriel could feel the fear of those who had died here in the earthquake, buried under bricks and stones. Their pain was still trapped, as fresh as if the tragedy had just happened yesterday. He walked through the rubble, his footsteps still silent. He was looking for the epicenter of this spiritual seismic activity, the heart of the pain. And then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound wasn't loud, very faint, but it was clear and deliberate. 3 rhythmic taps. It didn't come from a door or a wooden wall. It emanated from deep within a large stone wall. A wall that seemed to be the foundation of the entire wing. Gabriel stopped, listening. Silence. Then, again. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, the same intensity. It wasn't the random sound of a crumbling house. It was a signal. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. Someone was trapped. Not trapped in the house, but trapped within its walls. Gabriel approached the cold stone wall. He placed his palm on the rough surface. He closed his eyes. He no longer tried to listen with his ears. He listened with his soul. And he felt it. A confined presence. Not Eleanor's spirit. Not the panicked spirits of earthquake victims. This was something else. Something older. Angrier. Something that had been sealed here for a very long time. And the earthquake might have weakened that seal. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping sounded again. This time a little more impatient. A little stronger. As if it knew someone was listening. Gabriel opened his eyes. His weary face now bore a gravity that even Mr. Gabriel had never seen. The problem with this house wasn't just souls trapped by guilt. Something had been deliberately buried here. And Annelise, with her bloodline, might be the key not only to freeing Eleanor, but also to opening an ancient prison. He had found Whitgrave Manor's true debt. And it was more terrifying than any ghost. After the message in the emerald green flame vanished, the Hall of Fires returned to its silent, ghostly state. The spirits repeating their tasks had faded, and the invisible footsteps had also stopped. Annelise stood alone in the stillness, her heart still pounding from her encounter with Eleanor's silhouette. Fire holds names. Mirrors hold shadows. The words echoed in her mind. She looked down at the singed letter pieces in her hand, then unconsciously touched the broken silver mirror and the hair brooch in her jacket pocket. They weren't just old objects. They were tools, keys. But to open which door? She didn't know where she should go next. The corridor was long and dark in both directions. But just as before, the house seemed to be guiding her. A gentle urge, an invisible pull, directed her towards the end of the corridor, where the white marble fireplace had just flared up. As she drew closer, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Right next to the fireplace, on the patterned wallpaper, there was a faint outline of a door. A perfectly concealed door, with no handle, no hinges. It was just a part of the wall. But after seeing Eleanor's silhouette, Annelise knew that not everything in this house obeyed the rules of ordinary sight. She reached out, pressing her palm against the center of the secret door. She didn't push. She just stood there, transmitting her curiosity and intent into the wood. She thought of Eleanor, of the diary, of the instruction, and the door responded. It didn't open. It slowly became translucent, fading like a ghost, revealing another dark passage within. Annelise took a deep breath and stepped through. As soon as she passed, the door behind her solidified, becoming a solid wall again. She was in a narrow, descending spiral corridor, built entirely of stone. The air here was cold and damp, unlike the erratic hot and cold of the Hall of Fires. It led her down, deeper into the earth, deeper into the manor's foundations. Finally, the corridor ended before a round ebony door. It had no lock, just a small iron ring to pull. Annelise pulled it open. The door opened with eerie silence. She stepped in and froze. This room was completely different from anywhere she had seen. It was circular, and the curving stone walls gave the feeling of standing inside a giant well. There were no windows. The only light came from an unknown source. A diffused, silvery grey light that made everything in the room seem flat and lifeless. In the very center of the room was a large round table, its top made from a single slab of black marble, polished so highly that it reflected the dark vaulted ceiling like a still lake. Around the table were 3 intricately carved wooden chairs, but they were pushed back, as if the last meeting here had ended in haste. On the surface of the stone table, there were symbols etched and covered with a faint layer of dust. Annelise moved closer. These were not ordinary letters. There were astrological symbols, zodiac signs, planetary symbols. There were characters from the Enochian alphabet, the language of angels. And there were symbols she had never seen before. Strange drawings that seemed to be Eleanor's own private code system. She realized where she was. This was the séance room. The place where Eleanor had tried to communicate with the other side. Where she sought guidance from spirits. But the atmosphere here didn't feel sacred. It was heavy with anticipation. With centuries of disappointment. This was a waiting room between two worlds. And it was filled with the echoes of questions that were never answered. As her eyes adjusted to the strange light, Annelise began to notice the curving stone walls. At first, they seemed smooth and empty, but when she looked closer, she saw they were not empty at all. Faint, almost translucent letters were slowly appearing on the stone surface, as if written with frost or breath on a cold pane of glass. They didn't appear all at once. They slowly solidified from the air, forming names. Dozens of names. Then hundreds. The entire wall of this circular room was covered with names, written in various handwritings, overlapping each other, forming a horrifying tapestry of memory. Annelise read a few names near her. James Blackwood, 1863, Gettysburg. Thomas O'Malley, 1877, land dispute. Maria Flores, 1881, stray bullet. Samuel Sammy Pike, 8 years old, 1885, hunting accident. She understood. These were their names. The souls who had died by Whitgrave's weapons. This was Eleanor's list of deaths. An indictment written in souls on the walls of this prison. Each name was a tragedy. A life cut short. A pain that still echoed. The sheer number of names was overwhelming. They covered the walls from floor to the dark vaulted ceiling. They were a constant reminder of the burden Eleanor had to carry every day. Annelise felt her chest tighten. The pain in this room was too great. Too dense. It wasn't just the pain of one person, but of thousands. She backed away from the wall. And that's when she saw it. In the area between the round table and the wall. There was something else. A circle formed by 13 antique mirrors, placed on ebony stands. They weren't facing outward, but all were directed towards the center of the circle, creating an enclosed space of reflection. Annelise, driven by a curiosity stronger than fear, stepped inside the mirror circle. She held her breath. 13 images of herself stared back at her. But no two images were exactly alike. And no image was real. The mirror directly in front of her reflected a version of her with completely empty, lifeless eyes. The mirror to her right showed an Annelise screaming silently, her face distorted in horror. The mirror to her left reflected a girl decades older, with white hair and deep wrinkles of suffering etched on her face. Each mirror was a fragment of fear. A terrifying possibility of the future. One mirror showed her gradually fading, becoming translucent. Another showed her wearing Eleanor's black dress. Annelise spun around in panic. All the reflections were distorted. Ghastly. A chorus of distorted versions of herself. This wasn't a physical trap. This was a psychological attack. The house was showing her what it could do to her. What she could become if she stayed here too long. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the terrifying images. But they were still there, etched into her mind. She felt her sanity begin to crack, amidst her panic. Her hand clenched in her jacket pocket and touched the silver hair brooch. The coldness of the metal was like an electric shock, pulling her back to reality. Mirrors hold shadows. Eleanor's words echoed. These mirrors were holding the shadows of fear. She had to do something. A thought flashed. An act of faith. Of desperation. Still with her eyes tightly shut, Annelise slowly knelt down. She took the silver brooch out of her pocket. Her hand trembled. She didn't know what she was doing, but she felt it was the right thing to do. She held the brooch out in front of her, towards the central mirror, the one reflecting her face aged by suffering. She took a breath, and gently placed the sharp point of the silver brooch onto the cold surface of the mirror. The moment metal touched glass, everything changed. All sound around her vanished. It wasn't the heavy silence from before. This was an absolute emptiness. The echoes of names on the walls, the frantic beating of her own heart, the hum of the strange light, all ceased. A perfect, pure silence, almost painful in its intensity. The feeling of being watched, the sense of angry spirits, also dissolved. She was completely alone. The silver brooch, upon contact with the central mirror in the circle, seemed to have created a safe zone, a bubble of stillness, cutting her off from all the house's influences. It was a key to turn off the chaos. Annelise slowly opened her eyes. The distorted reflections in the other 12 mirrors had vanished. They were now just ordinary mirrors, reflecting the empty stone wall behind her. But the central mirror, the one she was touching, reflected nothing. Its surface was now as black as a starless night. And from within that darkness, an image began to form. She didn't appear suddenly. She slowly emerged from the mirror's darkness, not as a terrifying ghost, but as a memory trying to reassemble itself. First the eyes, deep and sad, then the delicate but gaunt face, and finally the entire tall, slender figure in the familiar black dress. Eleanor Whitgrave's spirit was standing before her. This time, she wasn't a silhouette in the fire or an echo in the diary. She was here, truly. Though transparent and faint, she had a clear presence. She was no longer bound by the repetition of memory. The silence created by the silver brooch had allowed her to truly manifest for the first time. Annelise felt no fear. She only felt a profound sadness. She could see the weariness in her eyes, the burden of a century of solitude. Eleanor looked directly at Annelise, a gaze filled with pain and a fragile hope. She didn't speak with her mouth. Her words echoed directly in Annelise's mind. A clear and urgent whisper. "Thank you." The whisper echoed. "The brooch is a compass. It points north, towards silence. You have given me a moment of peace." Annelise could only nod, tears starting to fall again. "I have seen you for a long time," Eleanor's spirit continued. "In dreams, in echoes. I knew you would come. I left the instructions. But I didn't know you would be strong enough to come this far." She extended a translucent hand, as if to touch Annelise but couldn't. "But our time is running out. Your presence, your blood, it has awakened not just me. It has also awakened what is imprisoned in this house's foundations. What even I fear. What I built this entire labyrinth to seal away." The image of the 3 taps in the stone wall that Gabriel heard seemed to flash in Annelise's mind. A memory she hadn't experienced. "It's growing stronger," Eleanor whispered, her gaze looking in some direction out of the room. "It senses you. It wants to use you to break free." She turned back, looking directly into Annelise's eyes, the urgency in her voice reaching its peak. "Listen closely. My last descendant. If you still bear the Whitgrave name, you must bear the responsibility of this family. You must close the last door." "The last door?" Annelise whispered aloud, her voice trembling. "Where is it?" Eleanor's spirit didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly raised her translucent arm and pointed in a direction, towards the north wing, where it had collapsed, where Gabriel was standing. "It's not a wooden door. It's a crack in the seal. It lies where the house was most severely damaged. Go north. Go towards the pane. The brooch will guide the way. Use it to seal the crack, before it's too late. Before it breaks free." Having said that, Eleanor's image began to fade. The silence created by the brooch couldn't last forever. Her energy was draining. "Go." Her last whisper echoed, faint as a breath. "Finish the work I started. Free us all." Her spirit vanished into the darkness of the mirror. At the same time, the sounds of the surrounding world returned abruptly. The echoes, the whispers, Annelise's heartbeat. She remained kneeling there, alone in the circle of mirrors, still clutching the silver brooch. She had her answer. She had her mission. But that mission was more terrifying than getting lost. She had to confront what even the builder of this labyrinth feared. When Gabriel emerged from the ruined north wing, his face bore an even greater gravity than before. The inherent weariness in his eyes was now replaced by intense focus, a chilling determination. He had heard the tapping from within the walls. He had felt an ancient, angry presence, distinct from the sorrowful spirits of the Whitgrave family. He knew that Annelise wasn't just lost in a labyrinth of memories. She was moving straight towards the center of a prison. and her own bloodline might be the key to opening that very door. He walked through the ruined corridors, returning to the main area of the manor where the lights and chaos of the outside world were encroaching. Mr. Gable and Lieutenant Al-Jamil immediately approached, their faces filled with anticipation and worry. "Did you find anything?" Al-Jamil asked, his voice impatient. "We've swept this area 3 times. Nothing." Gabriel didn't answer the question. His gaze swept the room, ignoring the police officers and rescue workers. He was looking for something else. He walked straight to a large, smooth wall, covered in dark patterned damask. To everyone else, it was just a normal decorative wall. But to Gabriel, this was where the house's spiritual energy lines converged unusually. This was a weak point, a thin veneer hiding a deeper truth. "This wall," Gabriel said, his voice deep and decisive. "Break it down." Lieutenant Al-Jamil looked at him as if he were insane. "Break down a wall? What are you saying? It's part of a historical monument. We can't just—" "No time," Gabriel interrupted, turning to look directly at the officer. For the first time, there was an unshakable pressure in his gaze, a weight of centuries that made the seasoned lieutenant take a step back. "What you're looking for isn't in this house. It's inside this house. Break down the wall. Right now." Mr. Gable, who had witnessed the ritual at the gate and felt the extraordinary nature of this man, immediately spoke up in support. "Just do as he says, Lieutenant. I'll take full responsibility." The determination of both men, coupled with the desperation of the situation, convinced Al-Jamil. He signaled 2 rescue workers to bring crowbars and sledgehammers. They began their work hesitantly. The damask was torn away, revealing a layer of old plaster. The first hammer blow echoed, dry and out of place. The plaster cracked, dust flying everywhere. And then, the crowbar plunged into a void. "There's a hollow space," a rescue worker shouted. They worked faster. Sections of the false wall were torn open, revealing a narrow, dark, dusty stone corridor. A corridor that was not on any architectural blueprint. A cold draft, carrying the scent of damp stone and centuries of stillness, wafted from the darkness. It was the spiral corridor leading down to the seance room. Gabriel took a powerful flashlight and, without a word, stepped into the darkness. Al-Jamil and Mr. Gable, along with a few other officers, hastily followed. The stone corridor sloped down, deeper than they expected. Finally, it led them to a round ebony door. Gabriel pushed it open, and the group stepped inside. They stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight within. The circular stone room, the black marble table in the center, and the faint names covering the walls. But all of that paled before the image in the center of the room. Inside the circle of 13 mirrors, Annelise was standing. She showed no panic. She wasn't crying, wasn't afraid. She stood upright, her arms at her sides, her face completely calm. Her eyes, once clear and innocent, were now deep and held a wisdom far beyond her age. She didn't look like a rescued victim. She looked like a priestess standing in the middle of a sacred ceremony. She was waiting for them. As Gabriel entered, her gaze turned towards him. She nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement. A wordless communication between 2 souls who had seen things others could not. "Annelise!" Mr. Gable shouted, about to rush forward. "Stop!" Gabriel's voice rang out, not loud but full of authority, halting everyone. "No one step into that circle." He turned to Lieutenant Al-Jamil and the others. "Your work here is done. Get everyone out. Back to the main hall." And don't let anyone into this corridor until I call. But the girl, Aljamil protested. She's safe. For now, Gabriel said. But if you stay, you'll put all of us in danger. Your living energy will only make what's here stronger. Go. The certainty in his voice allowed no argument. Aljamil, though utterly confused, ordered his men to retreat. Mr. Gable hesitated for a moment, looking at Annelise with a pained expression. Then also turned and followed. The round door closed. Only Gabriel and Annelise remained in the séance room. Gabriel walked to the edge of the mirror circle. He looked at Annelise, not as an adult looking at a child, but as two soldiers looking at each other before a battle. You did very well, he said. His voice deep and quiet. You kept it distracted. Annelise didn't reply, just looked at him. She knew he wasn't just talking about ordinary spirits. Gabriel put the flashlight down. From inside his worn tweed coat, he took out two things. The first was a short iron rod, only about half a meter long, old and with a few rust spots. The second was a small, tightly tied leather pouch. He opened the pouch. Inside was a fine, off-white ash. This was not ordinary wood ash. It was ash from the bones of entities whose debts had been paid, collected over centuries, carrying within it the power of release and cessation. I need two things, he told Annelise, the broken mirror, and the hair brooch. Without hesitation, Annelise took Eleanor's two tokens from her pocket and carefully placed them on the stone floor, just outside the circle. Now, Gabriel said, his voice growing more serious, when I begin, do not move, do not speak, and do not be afraid. No matter what happens, you are the anchor here. As long as you maintain your calm, the seal will hold. Annelise nodded decisively. Gabriel took the iron rod and stepped inside the mirror circle. He walked to the very center, right at the focal point of the 13 mirrors. He forcefully thrust the iron rod into a small crack on the stone floor. The rod stood upright, like a spiritual lightning rod, a grounding point for the chaotic energies about to be unleashed. Next, he knelt down. He poured some bone ash into his palm, and he began to draw. He didn't draw complex symbols or pentagrams. He drew a map. But it wasn't a map of the manor. It was a map of pain, of debt, with fine ash lines. He drew a large circle, symbolizing the house's confinement. Inside that circle, he drew straight lines, curving lines symbolizing the spiritual energy flows he had sensed. He drew the path of the number 13. He drew the location of the daisy bedroom, of the Hall of Fires. Every line he drew was precise and purposeful. And in the very center of the map, he drew a symbol, a spiraling shape tightening inward, symbolizing a prison within a prison, a weakening seal, where the demon was confined. As he drew, the names on the walls seemed to become clearer, and the whispers in the room began to grow louder, a chorus of pain and anger. The house was reacting. It knew someone was trying to interfere with its morbid balance. When the spiritual map was complete, Gabriel took the broken silver mirror and the hair brooch. He looked at them for a moment, as if looking at the legacy of an entire family. This was Eleanor's pain and also her key. He carefully placed the two items in the very center of the ash spiral, right next to the iron rod. He placed the brooch on top of the mirror's crack, forming a silver cross. And then, he placed both of his palms over the two items, pressing them down onto the stone floor. He closed his eyes and began to whisper. The words he spoke were not English, nor Latin. It was an older language, a language of earth and stone, of memory and forgetting. He wasn't giving orders. He was negotiating. He was recounting the story of the debt, acknowledging it, and then offering a final payment. He was using his very nature, the debt-bearer, to mediate a final transaction. As soon as he began, the entire room trembled. It wasn't a slight tremor. The entire stone foundation beneath them shook violently, as if a giant imprisoned beast below was trying to break free. The mirrors in the circle clattered. Dust and small pieces of plaster fell from the ceiling. The names on the walls glowed brightly, and the whispers turned into a roar of thousands of souls. A sonic wave of torment. Annelise, despite her fear, followed Gabriel's words. She stood still, her hands clasped, her eyes closed, focusing on the stillness within herself. She was the anchor. From beneath the floor, right where Gabriel placed his hands, a black light, thick as crude oil, began to seep out, trying to resist the pressure from his hands. An inhuman growl echoed from deep within the earth, a sound of primordial anger and hatred. Gabriel didn't flinch. His forehead was beaded with sweat, but he continued to whisper the ancient language. The iron rod beside him began to emit a faint blue light, acting as a fuse, drawing in the worst energies and channeling them into the earth. The room shook more violently. A crack appeared on the marble table. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The tremor ceased completely. The roar of thousands of souls vanished. The black light receded back into the earth. The names on the walls faded and then disappeared entirely. The room plunged into absolute silence. This was not the heavy silence of a haunted place. This was a clean, pure silence. The silence of a place that had been released. The silence of a debt that had been paid. Gabriel slowly opened his eyes. The broken mirror and the silver brooch had sunk deep into the stone floor, as if the floor had liquefied for a moment to swallow them, and had now solidified again, sealing them forever. The ash map had been blown away. Only the iron rod remained standing, its blue light extinguished. He tiredly stood up, swaying slightly. He had taken the largest part of that debt into himself. The old scar on his chest was surely burning. He turned to look at Annelise. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in hours, her eyes looked like those of an ordinary child again, though with a new wisdom etched within them. "It's done," Gabriel said, his voice hoarse. "It's all over." The house had been freed. The demon had been sealed again. And Annelise was free. When the last tremor finally subsided, an unprecedented silence enveloped the seance room. This wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of a haunted place. This was a clean, pure stillness. The silence of a prison whose seal had just been broken. Of a century-long fever that had finally subsided. The burden of the demon confined in the foundations had vanished. Gabriel tiredly stood up. Swaying slightly, he had used his own strength to confront and reseal the crack. And the price was evident on his exhausted face. Annelise still stood there, calm and silent, her eyes clear, observing everything with a chilling understanding. But the room wasn't empty for long. From the stone walls, from the very air, figures began to emerge once more. Not faint names, nor angry, frantic spirits. They appeared fully formed. A young soldier in a Union blue uniform from the Civil War era, his face stained with Gettysburg mud. A bearded miner, his eyes still holding the surprise of a land dispute that ended with a bullet. A woman in a simple dress, her hand still clutching an invisible wound where a stray bullet had claimed her life. And an 8-year-old boy, with wide, bewildered eyes, still wearing his hunting clothes. They appeared one after another, dozens, then hundreds, filling the space of the circular room. But this time, there were no moans, no hateful screams. The pain, the anger, and the confusion had been washed away after the demon was sealed. They were simply pure souls, trapped memories. They stood there, silent and dignified. A council of the deceased. All faced the center. Their eyes, now clear and without hostility, fixed on one single person, Gabriel. They made no demands, no threats. They simply stood there, as if awaiting a final judgment, a permission to truly depart. Gabriel looked at the sea of souls before him. He didn't see ghosts. He saw interrupted stories, forgotten tragedies, victims of history and a blood-stained legacy. He saw debts that had never been paid. His gaze held no pity, nor fear, only a deep understanding and a heavy acceptance. He knew his role. He knew why he was here. He turned to Annelise, who was still standing outside the mirror circle. "It's time. Child," he said softly. "Your work is done. Now is my part." Then, he turned back to face the hundreds of waiting eyes. His voice resonated in the absolute silence. Not loud but full of weight. Each word like an ancient oath. "I am not a judge," he said. His voice deep and calm. "I am not here to judge who is right, who is wrong, who is victim, who is sinner. Those things belong to another court. Not in this place." He paused, his gaze sweeping over all the spirits. "I only bear your burdens," he continued. One more time. That wasn't a promise. It was a truth. An affirmation of his nature and purpose. He didn't banish. He didn't cleanse. He absorbed. He bore the last echoes of their pain so that others could be free. Having said that, Gabriel took a deep breath and stepped into the very center of the mirror circle, standing beside the iron rod. He didn't look down, nor did he look around. He held his head high, facing them all. With a slow and deliberate gesture, he removed his tweed coat and tossed it aside. Then, he began to unbutton his shirt, revealing his thin but strong chest. The old scar there, a complex and deep scar, seemed to darken, twitching slightly as if it knew what was about to happen. He stood there, chest bared, exposed, unprotected, a willing offering. And then, the 13 mirrors in the circle, which had become ordinary again, began to glow. A soft, melancholic silver light, like moonlight through clouds. From each spirit in the room, a thin, shimmering thread of light, like spider silk, began to detach. It wasn't their soul. It was the last thing binding them to this world, the lingering pain, the echo of memory, the burden of an unjust death. Hundreds of shimmering threads floated in the air, all heading towards one single point. Gabriel. He didn't flinch. He stood there, chest held high, accepting it all. He opened his arms wide, not in a welcoming gesture, but an absolute acceptance. The threads of light rushed forward, not like arrows, but like rivers flowing to the sea. They converged, forming a brilliant silver stream of light, and pierced through Gabriel's chest. There was no sound, but the moment the light stream touched his body, Gabriel's face contorted in a silent agony, a suffering beyond all physical limits. The entire pain of hundreds of cut short lives, the fear, the anger, the regret, all poured into him in a single instant. His body bled, right at the point where the light stream entered. On the old scar, a new wound appeared. Fresh blood began to seep out, soaking his white shirt. It wasn't a cut or a stab. It was a perfectly round, clean hole. Exactly as if an invisible bullet had just passed through him. A new scar had been created. tangible evidence of the new debt he had just borne. And as Gabriel absorbed that burden, a miracle happened. One by one, each spirit, after relinquishing its last binding thread, began to vanish. They didn't disappear in horror. They dissolved peacefully. The young soldier smiled faintly, a smile of release, before his body shattered into millions of golden dust particles, drifting into the air. The woman clutched her invisible wound one last time, then disintegrated into dry daisy petals, fluttering to the floor. The 8-year-old boy waved goodbye, an innocent and serene gesture, then transformed into sparkling motes of light like fairy dust and floated upwards. One by one, they were free. Their faces no longer held suffering, only peace and silent gratitude. The séance room, which had imprisoned them for centuries, now became the witness to their final release. In a few minutes, it was all over. The last spirit vanished, and the last thread of light entered Gabriel's chest. When the last soul had departed, the silver light in the mirrors also faded. The room became truly silent and empty. No more echoes. No more feeling of being watched. The heavy energy had disappeared. The air became light and fresh. The debt had been paid. Gabriel, gasping for breath, clutching his bleeding chest, he staggered, but remained standing. He had done it. Again. He tiredly pulled the iron rod from the stone floor, put his shirt back on, and slipped his tweed coat over it, concealing the new wound. He turned to look at Annelise, who had witnessed the entire event in silence. In her eyes there was no longer fear, only reverence and a deep empathy. "Let's go," Gabriel said, his voice hoarse. "This house is now just wood and stone. Its story is over." He led her out of the séance room, back up the spiral corridor. As they broke through the false wall to return to the real world, Mr. Gable, Mr. Davidson, and Lieutenant Al-Jamil were waiting in tension. Seeing Annelise safe and sound, Mr. Gable couldn't hold back, rushing to embrace her. "Annelise, thank God." Annelise hugged him back, but she looked over his shoulder, her gaze still following Gabriel. The debt-bearer didn't stay to receive thanks or answer questions. His work was done. He silently walked past them, a solitary figure heading towards the main door. As he passed Mr. Gable, he paused for a moment. "Take care of her," he said, his voice low, "and tell this story, so no one forgets Eleanor's debt." And then he walked out of the manor, merging into the faint light of the dawning day. Annelise was led outside, into the arms of her parents, who were crying in relief. She was at peace, her face serene, as if she had just woken from a long and strange dream. When she turned to look, Whitgrave Manor stood there, silent in the early morning sun. It was no longer a living entity. It was just a house, an empty monument, its century-long fever finally cured. In the distance, on the deserted road, an old grey sedan rolled away, then disappeared into the morning mist. Inside, a man was driving, one hand on the new circular wound on his chest, his burden a little heavier, until the next imploration. A week after that fateful day, the sun returned to California. The sky was clear blue, and Whitgrave Manor stood there, silent in the sunlight, looking like an ordinary, if somewhat peculiar, historical monument. The police had withdrawn. The yellow tape had been removed. The Annelise Whitgrave missing case was closed in the file with the conclusion, "Victim found safe after several hours of disorientation in an unused area of the manor. No signs of foul play." To the world, the story was over. But for the Whitgrave family, It had just begun. After the first few days immersed in relief and happiness at being reunited with their daughter, the Whitgraves began a new search. Not for Annelise, but for the man who had saved her. "We have to thank him," Mrs. Whitgrave told Lieutenant Al-Jamil over the phone, her voice still trembling with emotion. "That man, Mr. Gabriel. He went in there alone and brought her out. We owe him our daughter's life. Do you have his contact information?" On the other end of the line, there was a puzzling silence. "Mrs. Whitgrave," Lieutenant Al-Jamil replied, his voice a little confused. "I'm not sure who you're referring to. There's no one named Gabriel in the case file. Our search team found Annelise in a basement room after breaking down a sealed wall." "No way," Mr. Whitgrave interjected, snatching the phone. "I saw him with my own eyes. A tall, thin man in a tweed coat. He spoke to you before he went inside. Her teacher was there too, sir." The officer's voice held a professional sympathy. The kind people use to speak to victims in shock. Trauma can affect memory. "Perhaps in the chaos, you mistook one of our rescue workers. We're just glad your daughter is safe. That's what matters." The call ended, leaving the Whitgraves utterly confused. They looked at each other, trying to find confirmation in each other's eyes. They had seen him. They were sure of it. They called the school, "Mr. Davidson," and the answer was similar. "Gabriel?" Mr. Davidson repeated, his voice full of surprise. "I don't recall anyone by that name. I only remember Mr. Gabriel having a very good hunch about the location of that false wall." How fortunate. Their memories, once crystal clear, were now denied by the whole world. They began to doubt themselves. Maybe the officer was right. Perhaps it was just a product of stress and desperation. The man named Gabriel seemed to have been erased from everyone's memory, vanishing like a ghost in the morning mist. No one remembered he had ever been there, except one person. Mr. Mark Gabriel remembered. He remembered every detail with painful clarity. He remembered the chill when he discovered his own blood connection to Annelise. He remembered the frantic drive in the night, the dusty archives, and the old book. He remembered the solitary iron gate in the middle of nowhere, the ritual with salt and a mirror, and the sudden appearance of the man who emerged from the shadows. He remembered Gabriel's weary eyes and calm voice. But when he tried to recount this story, he only received sympathetic glances. "Mark, you've been through a lot of shock," Mr. Davidson said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You've been overworking yourself. Maybe you should take a few days off. We're all glad Annelise is safe. You don't need to invent a fictional hero to explain that luck." Mr. Gabriel tried to argue, but his words seemed to fall on an invisible wall of skepticism. He realized that he was on an island of truth, completely alone. The memory of Gabriel was not a blessing. It was a burden. The burden of being the only one who remembered. The only one who knew the true cost of this peace. One afternoon, he returned to the school archives. His hands trembled as he searched for the old folklore book. He feared it too had vanished, that the entire experience was just a dream. But it was still there. The chapter on the debt-bearer, the address of the gate, and the pencil note. He hadn't imagined it. At least, he had proof of his own sanity. He sat there, in the silence of the archives, and for the first time, he understood a small part of the solitude Gabriel had to carry every day. From then on, Mr. Gabriel began his own search. Not for Gabriel, but to learn about him. He knew he would never see the man again. People like Gabriel didn't belong to the world of scheduled meetings. He spent hours online, scouring forums about paranormal phenomena, digital archives of folklore. He searched for the phrase "the debt bearer." And he found it. Not much. Just scattered fragments. Stories recounted by witnesses who were also considered insane. Just like him now. An old blog post told of a coal mine fire in Pennsylvania in the 1950s. Dozens died. But the sole survivor, in a delirium, kept speaking of a quiet man who led him through crumbling tunnels. No one else saw that man. An interview recording from the 80s. An old woman recounted the story of a haunted house in rural Louisiana. She spoke of a stranger who arrived, stayed one night, and when he left the next morning, the house had become permanently silent. She described him as having the saddest eyes in the world. All the stories shared a common thread, a mysterious man appearing at the peak of tragedy, resolving the problem through unexplainable methods, and then vanishing, leaving a strange forgetfulness to envelop those involved. They only heard his name in whispers, in legends told in the night. The debt bearer, an eternal wanderer, without home, without family, without a place to belong, a man with no homeland, and certainly will never have a grave, because his life is an endless loop of bearing the pain of others. And his grave is the deep scars on his chest. The Whitgraves' search for Gabriel never yielded results. Gradually, they also accepted the world's version, that their memories had been distorted by trauma. Annelise never recounted what she had seen, but sometimes, on quiet nights, her parents saw her sitting silently, fiddling with an old silver hair brooch that no one knew where it came from. The story of Whitgrave Manor, for most people, was over. But for us, here, at Whisper Horror Channel, it only opened another door. The door leading to one of the oldest and most terrifying legends. The legend of the debt bearer. An entity who traverses ages. Not to hunt, but to heal. But his healing doesn't come from magic. It comes from sacrifice. Every soul freed is a new wound etched onto his flesh. Every house brought to peace is a new burden on his shoulders. So, we have a warning for you. If one day, in your darkest hour, when you are facing an unspeakable horror, if you ever see a man emerge from the shadows, a man with weary eyes and bearing the wounds of others, do not speak to him. Do not thank him. And do not try to keep him. Let him go. Because the burden he carries is already enough. The story of Gabriel and Whitgrave Manor has ended, but its echoes remain. If this story has made you ponder, if it has touched a dark corner within you, let us know by leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments section. Your interaction is our motivation to continue delving deeper into the ghosts of history. Will other houses keep their secrets as long as Whitgrave Manor? Or will you be the next one to hear the call from within the walls?